Jews were permitted to live among the German state. In the German state, they will act as a fifth column and especially be dangerous in times of emergency and war. And so that began long before the Third Reich was established. This idea of the Jews as a fifth column originated in World War I, and with a disastrous conclusion for Germany in World War I. This is the insidious stab in the back myth, which you can see political cartoons from the 1920s perpetuated this idea that Jews did not do their part in World War I, and were somehow shirking their duty, and were actually later responsible for the collapse of Germany in 1918. And it started with a bit of disinformation. In 1916, the Prussian War Ministry conducted what it called a Jew count, or census, of how many Jews were serving in frontline units in World War I. The implication being that they were shirking their duty, they were driving ambulances, they were avoiding combat, and they conducted this census that fed into anti-Semitic pressure. The truth was that Jews were overperforming and overrepresented in frontline units. More had volunteered for service in the military than any other group of Germans. And when those numbers did not reflect what the Prussian War Ministry wanted to show, they buried them, they hid them. But the very fact that they conducted the census was enough misinformation to seed doubt about their role in World War I. So when the Nazis take over, they could play with what right-wing groups before them had put out there, which was the idea that Jews had not served honorably, that they in fact also were a fifth column that helped destroy the German war effort. And this is something that is replicated here. This is a Nazi cartoon that is taking the idea of Jews as string pullers, as those that benefited from the loss of World War I and were responsible for it. So how did the German Jews in general and Austrian Jews defend against this misinformation? There's another side of the story, because part of what we're talking about tonight is disinformation as a weapon of genocide, but also countering disinformation has been successful in the past. It can be. And for at least a good decade, German Jews were able to win over much of the German population by defending this charge with their own evidence, with real evidence. And they also appealed to emotion. So we have cartoons, not cartoons, but a sort of counterattack, a counter-narrative by the German Jewish Veterans Group that noted that 12,000 died at the front, that they did die next to their Christian comrades, that they were part of the war effort. And when the Nazis, long before they were in power, but still an active party, attacked Jews on this point of being shirkers, this group, the Jewish Veterans Group, put out their own literature, and you can see just by the image here, a knight with a sword that says truth, slaying the Nazi dragon, which is spreading disinformation. And it says, were we shirkers? And it went through a very methodical account of how they truly behaved in the war, and it was an effective tool. The problem, however, is that the Third Reich controlled the entire media universe after 1933. There was no way to have no room for that counter-narrative that had worked so effectively to work after 1933. So lessons learned here. Myths are easily replicated and recycled in multiple national contexts. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this infamous myth about Jews controlling the world, that started in the turn of the century Russia, easily disproven so many times it became a yearly event, had a new lease on life in the Weimar Republic. In 1920, this German translation went everywhere, and the fact that soon after the Third Reich comes to power, they're replicating this easily disproven, widely known to be a fake myth, and having it be so successful in generating anti-Semitism is proof that old misinformation can easily become the new dominant narrative. I'd finally say, as a way to round up, how we combat genocide, disinformation, or disinformation that can seed genocide, is to understand first, rapid reaction matters. So if we go back to what the German Jewish community did, they kept their own records. They were very fast at countering every bit of misinformation in real time almost. And that is in some ways easier now, despite the amount of disinformation out there. It's also easier to counter it with the truth. And the truth still matters, because for so long, in this case study, German Jews had won over most of the population to the dominant and correct view that they fought alongside their comrades bravely, and that they had helped the war effort, and that they were patriots. All of that was a successful example of countering disinformation. But when you have no access to the public, and the media has been dominated by the state after 1933, the myths take over. So thank you for allowing me to just give you a micro case study of what we mean by disinformation, seeding genocide, and also some ideas on how it can be countered.
So I wanted to apologize to our online audiences for the technical difficulties. I think we have it resolved at this point, and we should be good and set to go. So thank you for bearing with us on that. We are a small nonprofit, and it's always so much fun to figure out all the tech. Anyway, with that, Ashley, you are our more modern day speaker to this, and your research has mostly focused on Rwanda and Myanmar, or Burma, the Rohingyas. Can you talk to us a little bit about how things have evolved, how things have changed, and how governments mainly are still utilizing different narratives to other people so that these opportunities for mass atrocities, genocides, human rights violations, etc., can continue in a more modern day?
Sure. Well, thank you. And like my panelists have said, it's really a privilege to be here with all of you. So thank you for coming out and for this opportunity. I think in some ways it's the same old game, right? In so many ways, in that we know that genocide is a process, and we unfortunately have enough terrible evidence across history to know that a very important critical part of that process is that before a group or a state can start killing people, can start the job of destroying a target group, they have to prepare society for that in a number of ways. They have to classify the group, for example. They have to decide who is a part of this group. And that may seem strange, but even the Nazis had to put thought and intention behind identifying who exactly was a Jew and who wasn't, and through the Nuremberg laws and processes like this. So they have to figure out who's a part of this group. How are we going to identify them, right? Sometimes, what are the signs we're going to use? Is it a yellow star? Or in Burma, is it the beard, right? The traditional cultural dress of Muslims. They have to do these things. And one of the big parts of this is isolating a target group, not just physically, because yes, they have to think through how are we going to access this target group? Are we going to round them up in camps, in ghettos? But also to isolate that target group amidst the society itself, socially. They have to create divisions and fragmentation between the dominant population and the target group that they'd like to destroy. And one of the terrible ways that they do this is through propaganda. And so in Rwanda, Rachel already mentioned some of the methods that were used across decades, not just as the colonial powers came in. Oh, yep. Sorry, friends. Okay. So in Rwanda, this starts with the colonial powers as they come in and are trying to figure out how to rule the protectorate, and they create the Hamitic myth that describes Tutsi as outsiders, right, for their own purposes. It made more sense to them why they could work with this group if they were perhaps a little closer to Europe in origin and such. But then you have, this this project, and Rachel mentioned as well, of measuring noses. Imagine going around measuring people's noses. And it develops into this myth, this propaganda, that come closer to independence when the 9 Hutu intellectuals write this document known as the Bahutu Manifesto. They made a conscious decision to keep these myths that created hardened racial identities out of what had been more fluid political and social identities in the past. And so you see these myths continue and develop into things like the RTLM radio campaigns, and they infiltrate society. And when you think back at that time how powerful radio was, right? Most families received their news not from a television set, but from the radio. You had songs written, right, carrying this hateful anti-Tutsi rhetoric, this dehumanizing language of Nyanzi, cockroach. And when the genocide happened, so much of that work to divide society, to start the cracks and the fissures that would make neighbors turn on one another, neighbors who had lived next to each other for years, neighbors who had taught each other's children. To do that type of work takes intention and takes time that infiltrates society and how we talk about each other and how we think about each other. And in Myanmar, in Burma, we've seen this over decades as the Tatmadaw military has tried to survive, right, has tried to succeed in regime survival despite being deeply unpopular by creating a scapegoat. And that's what's happened in Myanmar. And they started by scapegoating the Rohingya in Keene State, but they've now expanded that group, that target group, to all Muslim minorities in Myanmar. So I just finished authoring a report that I did with the Burma Human Rights Network, and we worked with a team of researchers on the ground for 5 years. And they risked their own life because this is not an easy place to work and to gather evidence and sources. These researchers would gather, right, what documents they could, and much of it they sent to us was based on propaganda. And so 2 of the key documents that we used in our report were actually pamphlets created and published by the military. And as they sent them to me and we began to translate them because they were in Burmese, what came across, what I was reading, was just horrifying. And I remember having these moments just dawning on me how bad this had become and how dangerous this was now for all Muslim minorities, which aren't recognized. I think our report was the first one to say these people are in the midst of a genocidal process that has been progressing in Myanmar. And so I want to read to you just one very short section of the second booklet. And the military would publish these in times of crisis. So when a natural disaster, Cyclone Nargis, struck, and they did a terrible job of gathering humanitarian services, they actually, in their paranoia, blocked any help from the outside for over a week. So in times of deep popularity, they would retreat to this dehumanizing, hate-filled narratives to try and find an internal enemy. And as Dr. Crim said, a 5th column. And so the second booklet was published in 2008, just after Cyclone Nargis, and a very popular an election where the military regime was deeply unpopular. And it was titled Methods to Protect Against Extinction of the Race. And one of the things that I want to say is that so often in genocide, this propaganda is based on an existential threat narrative. Right? If we don't kill them, they're going to kill us first. And so in this pamphlet, They write, whereas the British destroyed the great tree called Myanmar Nation, they could not destroy the roots of the Myanmar race. Muslims are like worms, destroying the roots of the Myanmar race in the underground. If the roots of the Myanmar race are destroyed because they do not protect themselves from being eaten by these insects, the great tree called Myanmar Nation will automatically collapse. This time, the fall will never be revived and is an eternal collapse and death. And in the next section, which is titled, We Must Do Whatever is Necessary, it says, everything that should be done must be done. Any rules that should be followed must be followed. So we see this process happen time and time again in genocide. And what's happening now, to just wrap up my comments, but to answer one of Tim's questions, how do we see this evolving in our own times, is that now perpetrators and societies have begun using modern technologies to spread these narratives. So where it was the radio, now it's also social media. And in Myanmar, social media, Meta, Facebook has become one of the dominant platforms by which extremist Buddhist nationalist groups are spreading this hate-filled propaganda, oftentimes word for word of what's found in these military pamphlets, but it's reaching a wide audience. And this is also happening in places like Ethiopia. And when you speak, because the UN is working on projects to counter hate speech, oftentimes with positive speech, but when you start to talk about what to do about this, companies like Meta will tell you, well, we only, in Ethiopia, for example, we only have 2 or 3 people who can speak the dialects that they need to be able to speak to actually read these posts and to identify which posts need to come down because it's hate speech. And those 3 people are volunteers. So you can see the problem that we are not putting in the money, the effort, and the intentionality to counter these new technologies. And so we're in a very, very dangerous place as these propaganda and existential threat narratives find new avenues to infiltrate our societies and our very young populations as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We are working to up the audio without blasting people here in the room. So hopefully this is helpful for our online audiences. But Rachel, we want to turn to you next as the person who is doing the active work of trying to end a genocide, to prevent genocides. And can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the key things that you see happening as we move towards a potential genocide? What sort of warning signs do we see, especially as people create narratives? And how can we utilize that to bring down the rhetoric and hopefully prevent the worst of the worst?
Great. Just the easy questions to start, find all the solutions and articulate them in a short amount of time. I will start by saying that I don't have all the answers, but I'm extremely committed to this cause. And part of why I ask high school students and college students and my colleagues all the time to tell me other organizations working on this cause is so I can collaborate with them. If you're going to tackle a large problem, you can't work in a vacuum. You can't work in a silo. I love my academic scholars, but you can't work in a silo. And we've got to be thinking, as a lot of economists do, about scale. How do we scale efforts to combat disinformation and all these other things? So let's talk about what's working and what we can do. Because Palestine is experiencing genocide. Sudan is experiencing genocide. The Rohingya, the Uyghurs. Syria just fell. We don't even really know the extent of mass atrocities that have happened there yet. DRC, there's a whole list of countries. And anyone who's concerned about current affairs, which I know all of you care because you're here tonight, in person and online, could pretty easily, I think, make a list of 10 countries in the world that they're worried about. In fact, I did this experiment with high school students in Dallas. I said, where will genocide happen next? And we made a list together and we pulled up the US Holocaust Memorial Museum early warning system. And they had 3 of the top 5 high school students. So we all know genocide is happening in our world today. How do we stop it? Well, every good economist will tell you that if you're going to look at outcomes, you need 2 groups to look at. The group that experiences treatment. In this case, we have to learn from genocide communities, from survivors. We have to elevate their voices. We need to understand what has happened to these people and hear how they talk about it. If you were sitting in a room blindfolded with a Srebrenica survivor, with someone from Palestine, with a survivor from the Holocaust, with a Sudanese woman with a Rwanda survivor, and they just told you their experience of genocide, they would be indistinguishable. You wouldn't know, unless, of course, they cited, some of the specifics about the actual identity-based targeting. You wouldn't know where they were from. Our most important identity is our human identity, human dignity. That's where we start. If in your communities you are being taught a hierarchy of identities, and those are being reinforced, then you have the moral obligation to teach that human identity is the most important. When I'm meeting with groups of parents, when I'm meeting with politicians, they say, well, that's really not going to happen here, genocide's not going to happen here. I say, who were you taught to hate? And it always catches them off guard. What are you talking about? Who were you taught to hate? Or in lesser terms, to exclude. Who are you taught to exclude? Around the dinner table, oh, we don't talk to them. They're from that political party. We know this is happening. Or in a high school setting, oh yeah, that kid smells funny. He's from fill in the blank country. People joke about this kind of stuff, but then serious things happen at a political level, at a government level, and now we're not just joking. It's a warning sign. It's a signal that not now, but as they both mentioned, these propaganda campaigns started years, decades in advance, because it takes so much time to poison people, to convince them. So the first way you disrupt the cycle of genocide is to find where hatred is being taught and intervene. No, actually, we don't hate them. Well, I'm really scared of them. Well, let's get to know them. Why don't you invite them over for dinner? Why don't we go to the caucus meeting together? Oh, we both have children on the same soccer team. This sounds cliche. It's not, especially in the age of social media. 20 years ago, we were talking at caucus meetings. Now they're online, so we don't even really see each other, right? You've got to bring the human back into your everyday interactions, and you've got to put yourself in proximity with people you don't know, don't agree with, or don't identify with. You have to be interacting with people you don't identify with. Okay, Rachel, that's really nice. That could probably work in Keene. That could probably work in New Hampshire. But what about at a larger scale? Well, let's talk about what's worked at a larger scale. There's an amazing film, one of my favorite films that I've studied meticulously to understand how a genocide was stopped. So here's the second half of the equation. You look at where genocide's happening, then you look at what economists call the counterfactual. The group of people who could have, should have, would have had a genocide, but then didn't. Those countries exist. And those case studies are as important as Rwanda. They're as important as what's happening to the Rohingya and other places. Let's talk about Liberia. What happened in Liberia? Well, let me tell you. Tell me if this relates to anything you've seen recently on any of the channels you subscribe to. A president of Liberia bitterly loses an election, and he's so angry about it, he tries to take back the election. The new president comes in and says, we're going to exile the former president. They exile the former president, banned from the country. Former president gathers a huge group of supporters, starts to spend a lot of time and money preparing his political message, his propaganda. Several years into the new presidency, old president comes back, reignites the dissident group in the country, and starts mass killings, starts kidnapping, starts kind of this internal civil war. 2 presidents. Could that happen here? Gosh, I don't know. It's not like we're coming upon the most consequential election in just 3 years' time. Okay, so let's keep going. So it's a political battle and it's a civil war. You are all, I think most of you are actually old enough to remember that civil war. It was televised. People talked about the civil war in Liberia and what was happening. Now, obviously, this is a simplified history. You should talk to experts on Liberia. You should talk to Liberians themselves. But let's just fast forward. After years of this kind of skirmish and civil war, it gets crazy. The presidents start arming their militias. There's a flow of weapons into the country. Pretty soon, this is not just political kidnappings, disappearances, and isolated killings. This is a full-blown civil war. They're recruiting their sons. They're recruiting their youth. And people pick up the call to arms because the economy's in shambles. People are hurting economically. They look for someone to blame. One of the #1 indicators of genocide that we're monitoring. So then, after all this political conflict, they say, you know what? It's not just about political party. It's because they're part of this tribe. Now it turns to another identity crisis, inching closer and closer and closer to genocide. Okay, enter the scene a concerned citizen by the name of Lima Gobi, and many others who I've had the pleasure to meet in Liberia, in person I'll add. She says, we need to pray. We really need to pray. Gathers her friends. They start praying every night. After about a week of this, they're Christian women, said, you know what? I don't think prayer is going to be strong enough in this situation. We need to pray and act. They gather 1,000 women. Okay, what are we going to do? Let's all dress in white. Let's boycott. They plan a boycott. Okay, that kind of worked. What do we need to do? 10,000 women. Let's go sit out on the freeway where the tanks are going to drive to their next location. Let's sit on the freeway. We know our sons are driving those tanks. Let's tell them it's time to come home. Thousands of women dressed in all white sitting on the freeway, blocking traffic. Okay, that's not strong enough. Now, let's fly to the UN. We'll wait outside the door, and if they don't hear our demands, we'll go in and we'll hand them our printed demands. They do that. That doesn't work. Famously, the campaign turned when the women decided to do 2 things. First, a sex boycott. We will not have intercourse if you do not hear our demands. Second, Lima Gobi marches into this room where all the peace negotiations are happening and says, if you do not listen to our demands, I will remove 1 piece of clothing for every minute you do not listen. She was nearly naked by the time they said, okay, sit down, we'll listen to you. Could we do that? Yes. Did it work? Yes. And it didn't just work. The first female president in Africa was elected shortly after the genocide was stopped. The civil war was ended. These mothers then turned around and led the disarmament movement. Okay, so what are the big lessons here? Organize. Who are your group? Who are your people? Who do you pray with or not pray with? This isn't specific to religious groups. You need to organize, and then you need to organize with those organizers and create a large network of people who, when you say, this is our red line and we're not okay with it, you're going to go march on a freeway or sit on a freeway or show up in Washington or show up at the school district office or do whatever it takes to peacefully boycott, protest, let your voices be heard. You need a leader. You need someone who can say with confidence, I'll go into that room and start undressing, or I'll lead this or that. We do have leaders among us. They might not be willing to run for public office. Bless them. I can understand why. Maybe they are. Support them. Find your leaders. You don't have to agree on everything. You don't have to be of the same faith. You don't have to be of the same age or background. Someone, though, on these points, okay, we're genocide scholars. We agree that the definition is incomplete. All right, who's going to speak first? It's like a glorified group project. Okay, you be the speaker for the group today. I'll be the speaker for the group tomorrow. We can do this. We can do this here. We can do this in the Middle East. We can do this in Africa, and it works. We have the data, as mentioned, for all the data we have on how genocide happens. We have data on how it was stopped. And I'll share more insights as we continue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that positive and hopeful message in a space that can feel very unhopeful. So I'm watching our questions as they come in online, and of course, as expected and unsurprising to anyone, a lot of it is centering around the Israel-Gaza conflict and what we see there. We have people who are on both sides of the aisle, we'll term it. So can you just give us, you did a great job, I think, with the Keene students earlier today, talking, Rachel, about this conflict, the historical roots of it, and what we're seeing today. So can you just share a little bit about what we know and how that impacts and how that's reflected in the conversation about genocide?
Yes, do either of my colleagues want to comment on it before I jump in? Okay. I just want to make sure I'm not being a MyCog. Okay, what do we know? We know that Hamas is a body that has genocidal intent. They have published their charters. They have made their intentions known. They would like all Jews to be destroyed. We know that as of 5 weeks ago, the United Nations has designated what's happening in Palestine as genocide. And we know that when there is mutual genocidal intent by two groups in bitter opposition to each other, that women and children are going to be disproportionately affected. And that has surely been the case in this conflict as in other conflicts we're seeing in the world. We know that Israel-Palestine, let's talk about the economics of genocide for a second. It's not random. This conflict between these two groups is not October 7th new. It's not even 1990s new. It is hundreds of years old. And genocide is not a linear path that we follow, A plus B equals C, and now we have genocide. It is a cycle. The economic data shows that a country that has experienced genocide in the past is 3 times more likely to experience genocide in the future. That's a causal statement. So Israel's vulnerable, Palestine is vulnerable. Who else in the region's vulnerable? And now we know why the whole region's involved. We know that the United States is Israel's oldest ally. We know that the United States has no formal process to designate, prevent, or respond to genocide. We know that economic interests put the value of human lives at the bottom of the policy priority poll. So if you're feeling like you have to take a side on Israel-Palestine, I am of no help to you. Human lives are being lost. We need to stop war. We need to stop genocide. We need to end what's happening in Israel-Palestine as soon as we possibly can, by whatever means we can, peacefully. We need to stop an equally harmful outcome of this war, which is that people think they have to choose Israel or choose Palestine and then die by their stance. Does that help Jews? Does that help Palestinians? And where else in the world are we seeing these conflicts? We know that Palestinians, are not just living in the land of Gaza. We know that part of this conflict stems back to a family. Are family conflicts especially bitter, in my experience? Yeah. We know that Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine all share heritage, religious and familial. We know that Jews are persecuted all over the world and that anti-Semitism is on the rise. So the only way we're going to stop the genocide in Palestine and to stop groups that have the intent to destroy Jews all over the world is to try a new approach. Polarization doesn't stop genocides. It fuels them. We have to take a radical approach of coming together on these issues and focusing on saving human lives. If we focus on the definition, on sides, on is it genocide, is it not, I think famously of the words that were shared by Alison DeForges, just as a historical reference point. While the Rwanda genocide was happening, people could not agree whether it was genocide or not. After the Rwanda genocide had run its course, the United States still had not designated Rwanda as genocide. And they still couldn't agree that even then it was genocide. They had a whole series of meetings on the Hill, congressional testimonies from both sides, from every angle. And famously, Alison DeForges, a practitioner, works for a very large nonprofit. You can read her words in the record. She says, look, if it's between saying the word or saving lives, I'm for saving lives. I'm not trying to be cliche. I'm not trying to avoid the issues. People smarter than me can debate what the definition of genocide is when we're not trying to stop it. Those conversations are going to last for years after the conflict has stopped. I'm concerned about human lives. I'm concerned that this is being publicized on social media and that, follow the money, think about an economic approach, messages on both sides are trying to distract you from the fact that people are dying who don't have to die. So please call your representatives. Please work with nonprofits that are centering human dignity in their efforts and working at a local level, by the way. There are many Israelis who don't want this. There are many Palestinians who don't want this. They risk their lives every day to come together. There's a really wonderful group that I'll just highlight briefly, Women Wage Peace, led by an Israeli and a Palestinian woman, hand in hand. They've been trying to work across borders and boundaries and identity walls for well over 2 decades. Find the local groups that are centering human dignity, that are doing this work, and I think we'll start to see different outcomes. And depending on your sphere of influence, use it. Obviously, Bellwether and academics, we have a different sphere of influence. I'm doing everything I can to work with governments on this. I'm doing everything I can to bring attention to this, but just don't let the information and the messaging distract you from the reality that more people are going to die, and we could save their lives. And we could prepare the region for more peace, and we could prepare the world for more peace by not using polarization in a time of genocide. Polarization, again, it's a weapon of genocide. Don't participate. Don't participate in the genocide by being a polarizing voice on this topic.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's a great point. And Ashley, I want to turn to you and focus on Rwanda, as Rachel brought up the great quote around that. We know the Rwandan genocide eventually ended, but there's still problems within that country, still things that they are working on. Can you give us any lessons learned about what happens in the post-genocide space as communities try and heal? Are there things that we know have worked? Are there things that we know have not worked to bring communities back together?
Sure, no thanks. Well, I think, we do have so many incredible and powerful examples of communities coming together, and sometimes it's as simple as making the choice to do it and to start talking to one another and to figuring out the practical problems. In Rwanda, you had a decimated government whose treasury had been emptied. You had people who wanted a myriad of different things, victims who, of course, wanted accountability, who wanted justice, but you also had victims who were thinking about the day-to-day practical challenges of, how do I go to work tomorrow and leave my children at school, knowing that last week my neighbors were trying to kill them? That's a practical challenge. Communities have to come together to solve those challenges and to build trust together. You had, families in the years after the genocide, as Rwanda tried to figure out how to deal with this memory, how to make sure it wasn't forgotten. You had families where their children were Hutu, and every day on their way to school, they passed memorials that were literally monuments of bones. And they had to be confronted with this psychological and ideological kind of message. My people were the killers. My people were the perpetrators. So how do communities have to decide to come together to say, we're going to find a way to move forward that leaves space, creates a space, an inclusive space for all of us, not to forget, but to build relationships that will move us forward. And so Rwanda did this on a number of levels. Government-wise, they created the Gacaca court systems, which is a combination of traditional mechanisms of dispute resolution and government-led initiatives to try and deal with the large number of perpetrators. And it involved things like confessing to the community. It involved things like partial amnesties and reduced
prison time and community service, and it's certainly not been without its critics for flaws in due process and things like that. It's very different than the type of legal system we see here, but it was an initiative that came from the country that had experienced these atrocities. Rwanda's government has also tried moving forward by removing ethnic identities from politics, making it illegal to talk about whether you are a Hutu or a Tutsi in politics and in political parties. And they're trying to move forward as Rwandan. And that is something that I think it will take several generations for us to really see how has that worked. I don't think we have the evidence yet. But really at the very, very communal levels, this is even as simple as neighbors. Maybe in one village, there's one neighbor who owns a car, who owns a vehicle, and maybe they're a Hutu. And it's as simple as building that trust again, right? When you have to go to the hospital, do you ask your neighbor to take you? It can be as minute as that, right? And then of course, this isn't quite part of your question, but then the legacy that I think is still a challenge of how do we address the Hutus who fled and are now trapped in Congo, and the atrocities and the genocide that happened in DRC after 1994 is still something that I think we can't forget when we talk about the legacies and what we're still working on. But I think that there's hope there, and there are strategies, and it really comes down, and I loved the example that Rachel shared from Liberia, to these communities making decisions that we are going to do this differently going forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that this is long term, that in the same way that genocides take a long time to build up that steam and then they hit that breaking point, it's going to take a long time to heal those wounds and heal the long-term work that went into causing that. But I also am interested in the conversation around how do we hold people accountable? How do we do truth and justice, truth and reconciliation, holding trials? And I think, Brian, perhaps at least, the very least, the most famous version of that is the Nuremberg trials. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of those trials and maybe some of the drawbacks as well?
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question, because we often look to the Nuremberg trials as a template to how to deal with justice after a genocide. And while the Nuremberg trials were an amazingly positive step forward, acknowledging that this crime without a name needed to be addressed, although they weren't concerned with the genocide so much as wrongful prosecution of war, and they had trials within the trials, such as the doctor's trial that dealt with euthanasia and the whole concept of eugenics being weaponized by the state. They also were very limited to the senior leadership of the Third Reich, which left hundreds of thousands of other perpetrators unaccounted for. So the Nuremberg trials stand in history as a precedent for not only the victors applying victors' justice, but doing so in a way that achieved the goal of identifying crimes against humanity as a template later for genocide, and also holding accountable the different elements of the state responsible for perpetrating genocide, not just military leadership, but the legal profession, the medical profession, the bureaucracies. Maybe some of you are aware there's this new film called Nuremberg that just came out that deals with Hermann Goering. And this is, I do like when we focus on the senior leadership and get into their personalities and what made them who they were, but oftentimes we lose sight of the fact that there were dozens of other trials that happened in the different zones of occupation that were far more consequential in bringing perpetrators to justice. The so-called Dachau trials that were held in the American zone dealt with everyone from camp commandants to guards to even local citizens who fed the genocidal machine. The Soviet zone, despite what we know and think about the Soviet concept of justice, maybe in 1945, 46, they actually had a very robust and fair system of dealing with war criminals in their own zone, the French and British as well. These deserve more study, and one of the things I'm excited to see come about in the next few years, the Holocaust Museum in Washington is starting a law, justice, and genocide project that is focusing on these lower level trials, because Nuremberg has absorbed all of our attention, but now's the time to see where you have smaller scale examples of justice being applied that dealt with the actual perpetrators in a way that could be replicated in other cases of genocide. And one of the things I was thinking about while Rachel was speaking about things that could be done, and me, the pessimist, I think historians are naturally pessimists. If we can't get buy-in from the more significant countries in the world into what international law is, or to respect the ICC, to respect what the whole concept of international law, how can we hold people accountable? One, which is the sad part, because you're holding people accountable, the genocide has already happened. But international law can play a role in preventing genocide, of course, but how can we, when we don't have buy-in from the major powers, so to speak? And the one thing with Nuremberg is that you had this unprecedented moment where the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France had all agreed on the same concept and procedure, and did so with great effect.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the International Criminal Court, because we recently saw them actually hold the former leader of the Janjaweed from Sudan, which is actually a very large and horrible situation right now, and has been for many years. We actually run diplomacy simulations in high schools on the Darfur genocide of 2009. This goes much further back than that as well, but one of the leaders has now been held accountable. On the other side of that, you also have Omar Bashir, the former president of Sudan, who is sitting in jail in Sudan, not for any of the horrible, terrible atrocities that he committed and were committed under his watch, but because he accepted a bribe from Saudi Arabia. So are there ways that we can improve the court of law, the international space, that will actually, hopefully, hold more and more people accountable for what they've done, and then maybe see a deterrent effect down the line? Anyone have a thought there?
Yes, there's a lot we can do. I'm not a lawyer, but I believe in the law, and I'll just say again, follow the money if you want to stop genocide. Law is crucial, but I'm not sure prosecuting criminals is a strong enough deterrence. I'm not convinced based on what I've seen. But with that being said, how can we use the law? Germany, the Netherlands, and maybe one other country in Europe took it upon themselves to prosecute ISIS fighters in state courts for the Yazidi genocide. And this has happened in the last 18 months. So the International Criminal Court is not without its flaws. We could wait for the UN to take action, or we could utilize state courts. I mean, Germany, a country that experienced genocide, understands the consequences, prosecuting ISIS fighters on national soil. That's huge. That's a totally radical approach to using the law as a deterrence measure. So where else could we see this done? The UK is the obvious spotlight. We know that UK citizens participated in the Yazidi genocide and returned back to the UK afterwards. And this is the case in many genocides around the world. So if state governments did more of the state level work to prosecute criminals of genocide at the state level, that could be an immediate and very effective and very radical approach to genocide prevention. A second thing I'll highlight is going back to the gacaca. So I think particularly if you're from, I'm going to call it a blessed nation, a nation where you have not had the same economic struggles, or you've not had the same political struggles as our brothers and sisters in the global south or in other parts of the world. We don't really know or understand as much what it looks like to set up a people's tribunal. But it's been done in Rwanda. It's been done in parts of South America, in Argentina and elsewhere. You don't necessarily need to wait for the UN or state government to hold people accountable. It is possible, go back and read about the Gacaca and other courts, people's courts that have been created throughout time, a group of people. In the case of the Gacaca, these weren't even lawyers. These were not trained attorneys, judges, etc., but enough people who said, okay, while we're waiting for the court to prosecute the more serious cases that feel really big and bigger than us, let's put together a council of people who hold people accountable. We can create those councils, and surely I envision a time where even states in the United States could start thinking about what this would look like. A people's tribunal to protect democracy, a people's tribunal to protect whatever it may be, and learning from some of these case studies. It's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, so we'll probably need to bring in some of the experts from Rwanda, from Argentina, from some of the places where people's courts and people's tribunals have been effective. But those are two, I think, concrete things that we could do with the law right now in any part of the world, using existing case studies to really kind of push the leverage and say, international law does work, even if it's not through the UN or NATO or the EU or other multilateral bodies that are moving slowly. Let's think about where it is working, and certainly we can learn from our European neighbors where they're already prosecuting these crimes.
Okay, so we have an interesting question here, and now I've lost it, of course. Things move around on Slido as people vote them up. Okay, right, so the question is from an anonymous source, but isn't the best way of saving lives right now to stop sending bombs to Israel and demand aid gets in? And I would actually expand that question to what role does funneling arms into conflicts, whether it's the UAE sending arms into Sudan, whether it's Iran sending arms into Syria, pick your genocide and pick your outside force that is making it worse. So what role does it play when the international community gets involved in the wrong way? How do we fuel these things, and why do certain countries, including our own, fuel some of the things that we see happening around the world?
Well, I would just say, I mean, this is almost a no-brainer. Like, yes, that's bad. Stop it. Stop. When we in peace, so my background's in peace studies, and one of the things that we would often have to look at, counterintuitively perhaps, is there a downside, even in a just cause, even in a conflict where one of the sides is being wrongly attacked or invaded? What happens when you send them all of the military equipment that they need to be a more equal dog in the fight, so to speak? And do you unintentionally prolong, sometimes into years and years, what becomes a drawn-out war that no one can win in what would have been a conflict that might have been over very quickly? And that's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult ethical question. Do you let a weaker side lose? And what are the consequences for all of the civilians trapped in the middle of that? So this is something we've been thinking about in peace studies for a very long time. But almost certainly, when you see such horrific atrocities being carried out against civilians, we have to throw ourselves into a political solution. There has to be a political solution put on the table. Some of this can be brought into real conversations of policymakers, because we do have to recognize, I like how Rachel's been saying, follow the money. You could also say follow the national interests, right? Politicians make decisions based on interests and economics and these sorts of calculus and determinations. And so, you do have to look at what do the sides see as their most urgent military and political objectives, and find spaces to begin bringing in mediators, to bring bringing in diplomacy to find a political solution that will save lives. And we have to do that so much sooner. One of the problems that we've already talked about is setting up this word, this category, genocide, as the ultimate, not only hierarchy of crimes, which isn't legally accurate, war crimes, right? Crimes against humanity have equal legal weight, carry equal legal sentences, and can be just as devastating to the people who lose their lives to those crimes. So we have to stop holding up genocide as this hierarchy of crimes, but also as the only point at which we will take serious action. And sitting around and debating, is it or isn't it genocide, always costs more lives than it saves. We need to step in when we see the signs that war crimes are being committed, that crimes against humanity are happening. And of course, we ideally do not want our economy, our military industry to be a part, right, of those crimes. So that's just what I would say to that. I don't know, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to add this point about the unchecked power of multinationals is, especially in the 21st century, is something that deserves a great deal more study and action in genocide prevention. We're speaking about states. The U.S. is sending bombs. Russia is sending weapons to Syria. It is multinational companies that are sending these weapons, and they're in their own. They may have a home base in one country, but they are truly international, and they have inordinate power within even the strongest democracy. If they have a vested interest and a profit to be gained from selling weapons to unsavory nations and militias, they will do it, and the enforcement and the intelligence that is needed to kind of understand where arms flow and the whole interdiction chain is lacking. In my previous life, I was an intelligence analyst, and I think a lot about genocide prevention and the relationship to intelligence, and especially with the case of Western intelligence in the United States, we're so focused on technical means and not human intelligence. We are very good at discerning the aftermath of genocide. Like, we can spot a mass grave from a satellite. We can see the evidence after it happened, but we have little or no training. And I know I'm someone who was an analyst, and so I know how I was trained. There's nothing on the idea of looking at prevention. It's usually for the evidence for a trial later. And part of that also is, we following the money. The most, and it makes sense after 9/11, one of the biggest innovations in intelligence was financial intelligence, following the money. We now have such a robust ability to do that, but we're not applying it to instances like genocide prevention, where it could do real-time effect. And I think arms transfers and how arms get from point A to point B is a perfect example of where technology and ability we have now that isn't being used.
Absolutely. I want to underscore that. I was exactly what I was going to say. There's no economy in the world that functions off of a single buyer and a single consumer. So one of the principles we need to think about if we're going to take this radical economic approach is agents in the economy and what role agents and agency plays. Yes, it's going to require saying, who makes the bombs? Who makes them? Where did they come from? Where are those partnerships? They're a lot of them shielded by corrupt governments who don't want you to know, but not all of them. We can do our research. We can become consumer aware. We can become buyer aware, and not just in this category, right? Again, this is where I think genocide prevention needs to learn from the climate change movement. Genocide prevention cannot be an academic discussion that happens in panels and then ends in panels. It has to be a lens that is adopted by every concerned citizen. The academics are going to give us the tools and the research and the data and the case studies. We have to put on the lens. oh, this doesn't concern me. I work at a bank in my local town. Put on the lens. How does it concern you? Where are the intersections? Where can you provide information or resources or both? Where can you provide, your own means to support the cause? So I want to underscore that we underutilize our economy in both directions, in prevention, but also in obtaining information. You are the consumer. And in the United States, there are billionaires. There are trillionaires, right? The first ever, I think, this year. We just passed that mark. But they're not the only user in this economy. And they're so outnumbered, it's crazy. But of course, if institutions start to fail, then you start to feel outnumbered, you feel isolated, you feel alone. That's the purpose of propaganda. It is to isolate the majority who could do something to prevent, to intervene, to stop. So adopt the lens, think about your agency, think about your role as a consumer, think about your role in whatever your profession may be, and start to think about these intersectionalities, and then I truly think we're gonna start innovating. One of my indicators of success for Bellwether, part of how I know we will have done our job, is when economic programs in the United States in higher ed start hiring genocide scholars. I can list 4 economists that I know thinking about these issues. Love the historians, not bashing on them. Love the lawyers, we need them. We need a lot of economists. We need a lot of people who could work for Deloitte to instead say, who's making the bombs? Where are they going? We need a lot of analysts. We need a lot of computer programmers. We need genocide studies to become an interdisciplinary sector that has lots of people from lots of professions asking the hard questions and getting answers. So anyone who's watching online or here who's interested in doing additional studies, you don't have to major in genocide studies. You don't have to major in Holocaust or peace studies. We love that, we need them, I honor those decisions. If you study business, you need a genocide prevention lens. If you study climate, guess what's gonna happen to genocide as climate change gets more intense? Guess what's gonna happen to supply chains? I mean, this is the kind of thinking that every person can do to join the Bellwether resistance movement and not waiting on, again, multinational companies, governments or otherwise. We outnumber them about 100,000 to 1, and we can take back some of this power by revealing our own resources, our own information, our own networks, and having these kinds of conversations on a greater scale.
Within that, we're getting a lot of questions online about, or in the room as well, I'm sure, about how we can and how we can stop ourselves and other people, media companies, etc., from falling victim to these disinformation campaigns, these propaganda campaigns. What can we learn from our past, from our history, and what can we do today as we are living in these segmented echo chambers of media spheres that we didn't deal with back during World War I?
Sure, I can say something quickly and then I'll turn it over to Brian. But, I think one thing simply to say is that, I'm sorry, I'm not, hearing my own voice so loud makes me doing the shivers. I think anytime genocide at its heart is about reducing a human person to one piece of their very complex identity, right? And it could be an identity that is dear to them, that they hold of great value, or it could be an identity that someone has ascribed onto them and doesn't even really map onto how they think about themselves as a person. But genocide at its core is about reducing the human person to one tiny piece of themselves and failing to see them as a whole person. So anytime you hear someone or you read a social media post that reduces another human being to one piece of themselves instead of treating them as a whole person, that's a warning sign. And sometimes that dehumanization is very obvious, right? Names, calling people names that are animalistic. So calling people worms or cockroaches or maggots. Sometimes it's more of a general reduction of a person to their political identity or to a political opinion, and attaching all of these assumptions or labels or accusations to that person because of that opinion. So anytime that you see that happen, be the person who stands up, be an upstander. If you hear that in conversations, say something. Say, that makes me uncomfortable to see someone dehumanized that way or reduced in that way. Be the person on social media who brings your whole self as a human being to the conversation and stands up against that. Social media allows us to be so rude, doesn't it? Be the person who stands up against that. And you know, when you're in conversations, ask questions that try to understand the whole person, right? We have lost and we are losing our ability as a society to talk to and about people we disagree with in ways that lead to productive dialogue. We have to reclaim that. We have to get that back. So in the spring, I'll be teaching a class on peace studies, and where it's been so many different things in past years, this year we're going to be working the whole semester on how do you talk to and about people you disagree with in ways that lead to constructive and productive dialogue. That's something, though, you don't have to have a degree, you don't have to be an academic. Everybody can work on this. Every parent can work on this. Around the dinner table, I think we started out talking about this. Every teacher, every person in a group of friends that doesn't always model this type of conversation, we can all play such a huge part. I'm now like eating the microphone, so I'm gonna turn, it's too close. I'm gonna turn it over to Brian.
Well, what came to mind is that I know that all the great historians of the Third Reich, and there are now multi-generations of them, say the very first warning sign or the first indication of how terrible the regime would be was the death of empathy, that the regime exterminated empathy as a value and substituted it with their own values that especially were taught to young people. Hitler Youth was started at age 9, boys and girls, but the targeting empathy as something that stood in the way of the Third Reich's ultimate goal was something they wrote about as early as the 1920s and then enacted on day one. And that is something you can find in all these cases of genocide, is it starts with killing empathy before you start killing people. A lot of you might be aware of the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. He was trying to understand why this particular killing unit, which comprised people who were not members of the Nazi Party, who were too old and fat to be in the military, why, when they were given guns and told to just start shooting Jews, did they do it? And in their trials, again, another consequential trial, they always went back to the values they were taught, and this again, a lot of them predated the Third Reich, but also their belief in clear disinformation. They believed the Jews were a threat to the German race, and they used it as a crutch to help them go about doing this daily work of shooting tens of thousands of Jews every week. And I found this connection between disinformation and what perpetrators do to be shocking, as did Browning and the whole host of scholars that followed him. Looking at perpetrators, they aren't born killers, and it's not a natural thing to do by any means, but if you have empathy removed and also you truly believe what you're being taught about this group's threat to you, that they're the ones bombing German cities, they're the ones who are undermining the war effort and why we're starving at home, then you can do anything. And to me, that idea of killing empathy sticks with me, because I see, as Ashley was talking, Ashley and Rachel have said so eloquently more than I, is that this is what is extant and our in today's world, and also where we need to start in addressing causes and solutions.
I'm going to read a quick quote and then we can share some final thoughts. Most genocides, this comes from Henry T. King Jr., Benjamin Ferencz, and Whitney R. Harris, their piece called The Origins of the Genocide Convention. They say, most genocides are committed in presumed defense of some particular ideal, whether it be religion, ideology, race, self-determination, nationalism. These are the things that usually motivate people to go out and kill and prepare to be killed. They justify it as necessary to protect their own conception of what the world should be like. It is important to understand this point. These are not wild, raving maniacs. You cannot kill an idea with a gun. You can only change it by a better idea. And that is something we have to recognize.
Okay. I know we are basically at time here. And I want to thank everyone for sticking with us through this wide-ranging conversation, and understanding that there's a lot we did not get to here today. There are a lot of genocides that I think the stat is a new one happens every 2.5 years. And so there's a lot going on in this space, and this is not intended to be the end of the conversation. We want this to be the start of the conversation. We want you to continue to engage in these kind of conversations. But I'd like each of our panelists to take a quick moment to leave us with what I hope will be, but doesn't have to be, a positive thought, a positive hope for the future. And if you have it, something that anyone who has engaged here tonight with us, anyone who has watched the recording of this could do, either in their daily lives or as a more extraordinary measure, to help the cause of preventing genocides. So I don't know who wants to go first there. It's a big question for sure, but.
I think I would go back to my first point, which is the truth still matters, and it is a powerful weapon, even in a contaminated, deconstructed media environment like the one we're living in. The truth can still matter, and that means this rapid response to disinformation is key, because if you allow it to fester, it becomes the dominant narrative. And we, again, as Rachel said, we outnumber the bad apples out there that are promoting disinformation, but that also means we need to be responsible consumers of information. A lot of us who teach always have sort of an information literacy project to know what are the trusted sources out there, and also be willing to look beyond your own echo chamber. And all of us do that to an extent. But as I demonstrated, that even in this era of when German Jews were really prospering after World War I, they did so because they had an excellent response to the anti-Semitic narratives flooding the zone, so to speak. And I'm terrified of the flooding of the zone happening now because it's exponentially more difficult to counteract. But it can be done when you realize that the truth still matters. And that means finding it and liking it and reposting it, but hopefully more than that.
Yeah, well, I would just say, Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide. I don't know that I would call him an optimist. He experienced so much tragedy in his life, lost nearly every family member to the Holocaust, but he believed that the law was something that you built, one stone at a time. And that if we built it now, that decades, generations later, someone would do something with it. And I was just at Toadstool for this little kind of coming out for a small book called Peace Talk, and it kind of just records all these different treaties and laws that have been developed over human history. And sometimes I like to think of it gives me this little tickle. What would Genghis Khan have thought of all these laws that you can't just slaughter anybody you want and it's okay? You know, it feels so hopeless. We look at the news and we feel so much despair, but sometimes we have to look at what we do have. The fact that we're even here together tonight, meeting to talk about this, people care about these topics. And I'll end by sharing what one of the women sitting in the audience as we were talking about this little coffee table book says, as we were talking about how to teach the next generation. And it left me with this feeling that as long as there is a next generation, we have hope. And she was an elementary school teacher, and she said, my students were the kindest, most soft-stepping, quiet, gentle students in the whole school. And everybody asked me how I did it. We had a bunny rabbit in the classroom, and she said, and I let it out, and I let it walk around, and she said I had to fight for that rabbit. I had to explain to the administrators how it was science, and you did the nervous system and the digestive tract, and I had to fight for it. But we let this bunny out, and they all learned to step quietly and to be gentle. And I just thought, you know, here we have all these ideas and theories and complicated things about how to prevent genocide, but look at what this elementary teacher was doing just in shaping a young child's perception of something, a being that was smaller and more vulnerable than they were. And it just stuck with me. And I think as long as there is a next generation to teach, and as long as there are people like you who are teaching a different way, that we have hope.
Oh boy. Can I start on a personal level and then share my final thoughts about our work? I'm as young as I look. I didn't come from a wealthy family. I don't have all the answers. I think I've said that a few times tonight. And earlier this year, I decided that we needed to engage the UK government to try and build more power between what the US and the UK do to prevent genocide. So I decided to work with the members of parliament that I know in my network to relaunch the all-party parliamentary group on genocide prevention. It's been defunct for about 2 years. And what that process entails is that I had to sit across the table from many, many members of parliament who just told me all the reasons why the committee was gonna fail, why it wasn't gonna work, why we're never gonna end genocide. You're an American, what are you doing in parliament? I heard it all. I heard it all. But I'll never forget one of the last conversations I had with a fairly influential member of parliament. And I was pretty fed up, to be honest, on a personal level. I was like, oh my gosh, this is just getting really depressing for me and for the world. And on she went, you know, I'm too busy, I can't do it. Okay, no, I do care about the issues, but you're not very powerful. Okay, I've never heard of Bellwether, you're never gonna stop genocide. On she goes, on and on and on. And I just said, okay, can you just pause for one moment? I have one question for you. If you can answer my question, I will leave you alone. When was the last time you sat across the table from someone who was as committed as I am to stopping genocide? Can you please give me their name and their email address so that I can meet with them? You couldn't answer my question. And I think in that moment, on a personal level, I decided, okay, I might not succeed. I might spend six years so far running Bellwether. I might spend another 10 doing this work and not seeing the movement forward that I want to see. But until someone can give me the name and the email address of someone that's doing it, I'm not going to stop. If I spend my entire life trying to prevent genocide and don't see the outcomes, was it a waste? I don't think so. Is hope a waste if you wear out your life trying to achieve something greater for our children and for our children's children? Wake up. This is not about me, my career, my legacy. This is about a self-fulfilling prophecy. The moment we give up hope, there is no hope. And I'm sorry, but we're going to stop genocide. We're going to do something about it. Bellwether's developing a model that links the early warning signs to policy responses, and I want to give a shout out to my research team. Incredible scholars, much smarter than I, building a system dynamics model to help us fill the warning response gap. We're working on scaling trauma healing programs for thousands of people for $25 a person all over the world to prevent grievances and unhealed traumas from fueling the cycle of genocide. We're having this conversation in the United States. I'm going to go and learn some more from these scholars. I'm going to read their work. I'm going to apply it into my work. We can't give up. I won't give up. And if you have, let's just address the elephant in the room. If you have financial means to support genocide prevention, do it. This is a movement that's coming into style, not going out. This is a movement that's gathering momentum, not losing it. This is a movement that's gathering evidence, not losing it. And we're going to stop genocide. Are we going to end it everywhere? No. There are malicious actors. There will always be in North Korea. There will always be some people that we can't reach and can't persuade. But even if we decrease the amount of genocide in the world, even if every person starts to adopt this genocide lens, as I've mentioned, it will have been worth it for me. I'm totally committed to this. And if you want to be part of the Bellwether movement, I can tell you what we need and how we need it, and I'd love to learn from you and partner with you.
Well, thank you to our wonderful panelists. This has been a fascinating conversation for me, and I could go on for another hour and a half, 2 hours. I won't put you all through that. But I do hope that if you are interested in learning more, you will reach out to the panelists, have conversations with them, share your insights, your feelings, your questions. I'm happy to share their emails with you if need be. And I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions further. Again, this should not be the end of the conversation. And we know that this is important work, and we appreciate everyone taking the moment in time to be here tonight, to watch online. Again, sorry for the technical errors earlier, but we really appreciate you all engaging in this and being here for this important conversation. Thank you for your support and your time, and have a wonderful evening.